uh, John Sloman refers to them as the Three Stooges, which is a fair and apt description sometimes of the behavior of some of the children of Noah, uh, to put it mildly. Because we also read about this horrible story of Noah's son Ham, who uncovers his father's nakedness, and this was the story that we read, which is another one of those kind of J stories that is an explanation for why things are. And the interesting thing about that story is that it actually is a knock um, on Ham's son Canaan, and we're going to read about all of the sons of those three boys, those three stooges, those three sons, if you will. It could also be the three my three sons. But
Yeah.
when we look at these stories, when we look at these people, we understand that again, these stories are meant to teach us how things happened, how they came to be. And today, chapter 10, we call the Table of Nations, is going to set up how we became, at least in part of the world, how we became the nations that we are. So while this is a dry list of nations, if you will, or languages or peoples, this is really not, I mean, we sometimes say it's the 70 languages that people speak. This really isn't a setup on languages. This is not really based on the languages that people spoke, but on their ethnicity, if you will, where they came from in the family tree of ethnicities. Which again, if you're interested in genetics and you're interested in uh, if you're interested in ethnicities, this is your bag then. So, John, why don't you start with chapter 10, which begins with a typical beginning for the P author, Ve'ele Toldot. These are the generations, or these are the descendants, translated here as these are the lines of these three sons.
I have a question before we
Yeah.
start. When we have chapter 10 and then there's one, two, three, like if I was reading a contract, that would be para one, para two, para three. Like I have a question about one already, like right after the colon.
So remember, the Bible, when it was originally written in Hebrew, when it was originally written down by scribes, doesn't have chapters and verses. It doesn't have breaks. Uh, so sometimes even the Hebrew breaks don't make sense. Usually the Christians who followed the Hebrew understanding of, very rarely does a verse not follow in Hebrew and English. Very rarely is there like a break that isn't the same in the kind of the Christian and Jewish reading. The Jewish reading of it, the breaks, if you will, the sentence ends and even the clause endings are the tropes. So the tropes, the way we chant the Bible, is how we've punctuated the Bible. By that I mean when we come to this little wishbone called the etnachta symbol, uh, it becomes a comma, if you will, or a semicolon. It's the marking or the distinguishing place, or colon sometimes, not really colon, but really a semicolon, or comma. It's between two clauses. It marks a difference between two clauses. So you can sometimes even stop right there and you get kind of an idea. But the way that we come to the end of a verse is this, what we call the sof pasuk, these two dots that looks like a colon, kind of. That is the end of a verse. And so in Hebrew, we use the colon symbol to end a verse, and then in English, they use a period. Now, again, these were markings that were put on in the by us over time, and the earliest versions of these things go back about 1200 years. The Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, don't have these markings. They don't have the trope. They don't have these markings. So the only other way that you kind of know where there are breaks are when there's line breaks. And sometimes, again, the line breaks would be a chapter break or a paragraph break, and they kind of make sense. They're always there for a reason. There's no break that you're like, well, that's just a scribal error. But um, there
Um,
could be differences. There could be. There were some differences between the way it was punctuated by even by us and the way it was probably intended by a scribe. And then, of course,
uh,
we also have scribal errors where we know, for example, that something dropped out, like part of the clause dropped out. And we said when we went back, when we did the book of Samuel, I told you that's the book where we just are, whatever happened with the version of the book of Samuel we have, there's a lot of scribal errors there. We know it because when we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, it confirmed it. We knew there was because there were verses that seemed to be missing, just wasn't a good copy of it. And so we've now kind of gone in and maybe put back, well, we haven't put it back in the text that we read in the Bible, but we have notes, we have footnotes that will say, well, the Dead Sea Scroll text has this for Samuel for this part that's missing. So sometimes there are scribal errors, and they were, we can kind of see them because we know there's a gap there. There's like a space that isn't necessarily written with a space, but we know that like something was inhabited that time. A line dropped out. And oftentimes it drops out because somebody would see a word repeated and they wouldn't catch it the second time. It's just we do it all the time when we read something. We read something and then we skip a line because we see that word in the next line and our eye takes us down to that next line. Well, the scribes did that occasionally. They would miss a line of text. They would use, like, let's say the name Noah was in both lines. Sometimes they would just make a mistake and a line would be left off because they missed the line. So,
uh,
generally speaking, it's not that important. It's not that big of an issue. But when it is, I'll point it out. Or when we see a footnote, that I know is an important footnote, we'll point it out. But yeah. So you're going to say something about the first line, or why don't you read the first line and
yeah,
then?
let me we'll move on. All right. Uh, these are the lines of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah. Sons were born to them after the flood. I don't have a question. It answered itself. The
Yep.
the descendants.
Okay, but
So
hold on. So let's just pause right there because we've already encountered these sons. They were on the ark with him. It says their wives were on the ark with them. So it everything here makes sense. It doesn't seem to fully make sense because in the J story, it seems as though Ham already has a son named Canaan. So there could be a slight difference in the understanding that Noah even had grandkids that were on the ark with him. But regardless, most of the people are born after the flood. Obviously, most of the even if they're grandkids, most of these people we're going to find are born later, uh, and it's really what happens to them after they get out. When they're repopulating the world. Shem are the Semites, roughly the rough, and I'll show you a map in a second. Roughly the area around Arabia, all the way up to the Tigris Euphrates. Ham is generally the area around North Africa, and Yafet is generally the northern area, what we would consider Asia Minor and into Greece. Now, we think that there's maybe some origin, maybe um, to uh, one of the Greek gods that's mentioned in Greek mythology, uh, Iapet, who's the father of Prometheus, one of the Titans. Maybe that's because they're Greek, or again, they didn't call them Greeks. We're going to call them right now Yavan, Ionians. And the word Ionian, that's one of the Greek tribes. The reason we call them Greeks is because the Romans named them the Greeks. They didn't call themselves, they still don't call themselves Greeks, right? They call themselves Hellenes, Helen, like the descendants of Helen of Troy. So the Greeks don't refer to themselves as Greek. That was what the Romans called them. And, they're known as Greeks. I'm not going to, get into it with whether we should call them Greek or not. They seem to be, most Greeks are okay being called Greek, but that's not what they call themselves. And in the Bible, they're not called Greek because the Romans haven't come on the scene yet. And the Romans aren't even mentioned in this table of nations because they're not even there yet. The closest we might have to them are the Etruscans, who are one of the precursors to the Romans in the area of Italy that they lived. So they might be mentioned here, but the Romans aren't even mentioned because they weren't even on the map yet when this list is created. This list really reflects kind of the world around 800, 900 BCE, where the Greeks even were just starting to make some noise in the Aegean, and they were starting to settle along the coast of Turkey, and they were even on the radar. But at this time, like the Romans aren't mentioned because they don't really exist. All right, so that's a little bit. We're gonna get as we go through these names. I'll kind of tell you who we think these people are.
Okay, and then I'll have a specific question at a
Yep.
specific time, and not right this second.
Okay.
The descendants of Japheth, Gomer, Magog, Madai, Yavin, and sorry if I
Yeah. Okay.
mess the names up. Madai, Yavan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tyrus.
Mhm.
The descendants of Gomer. There has to be a list where it just, you have a family tree because now you're really getting in, you start to forget this stuff.
So we get the sons, we get the grandsons of Noah, and then
Yeah,
we get their children, we get their descendants, right? So we'll go through that. Well, when we
yeah.
when we get through all of Yafet, I'll explain to you who these people are. Okay.
The descendants of Gomer were Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. The descendants of Yavin, Elisha, Tarshish, huh, the Kittim, and the Dodanim. From these, the maritime nations branched out. These are the descendants of Japheth. By their lands, each with its language, their clans, and their nations.
Yeah. So these are the northern peoples. Now, most of these people, we can kind of guess who they are based on other texts, especially Assyrian and Persian texts, who talk about these people because the Persians were the ones who were coming into contact with these people the most because they're further north, and also the people who live in Asia Minor. Um, so some of these are really important because they kind of make appearances later, and they're important for Jewish history. So, for example, Gomer, we believe, are the Cimmerians, not Sumerians, Cimmerian with a C. The Cimmerians are people that, or Cimmerian, but in the way it's come to us, these are people that live in what would be today Asia Minor, but also maybe all the way up to the steppes of Russia. And so these are people who were later displaced by the Scythians, who are also probably the people that are mentioned in Ashkenaz. The Scythians were nomadic warriors who really fought some battles with the Persians, and were pretty powerful people all the way up through the Roman era. The Scythians were really the people who they're kind of the bad news barbarians in the north, that you're scared of. They rode horseback, and they were some scary people, and the Persians couldn't conquer them really. They subdued them and kind of kept them at bay. But they're a factor all the way through to the Roman era.
Is there a connection between us being called Ashkenazi and
I was
Ashkenazi?
just yeah, I was
Oh,
just going to get that. So
okay.
the weird thing is that our ancestors in the Middle Ages, ascribe the Scythians or this Ashkenaz area, probably because it was pretty far north, they they thought of them as Germanic peoples, maybe because there were some similarities in their kind of frightening warrior nature, but also because the Scythians probably settled in to areas maybe as far, west as Germany, or maybe some of the areas where Germans would also eventually inhabit. And I don't mean like Germans from I'm talking about Teutonic Knights, well, they're not even knights yet, but Teutons, back when they were fighting the Romans and the Greeks and stuff like that, when they were pretty scary barbarian folk. So it could be that during the rabbinic period and during the Middle Ages, our ancestors kind of grouped them together. But that's why they call that area of Germany and France Ashkenaz. It definitely wasn't that far north, but for us, it was close enough. It was about as close as you can get. And maybe again, the people really saw themselves, or maybe the Jews saw them as kind of, um, a warrior people. And, there some of
Isn't
these
that
people,
nice that they can connect with warrior people? That's
yes, but it was interesting that today we call many of us call ourselves Ashkenazi, but the reality is that it's really was not that area. We're also going to see there's another area in the mention in the Bible called Sepharad, which was understood to be maybe France and Spain, but probably wasn't that far north either. It was probably, or and that far west. It was probably again in the area around Turkey. Again, Ashkenaz was probably Turkey or just above Turkey in the Caucasus. It wasn't that far away. I'm going to show you again in the map when we get through all of them. But but again, some of the other ones that are mentioned here too, Magog is mentioned later on in the war of Magog and Magog. We read about in Ezekiel, and then again later on, kind of referred to in the Christian Bible and through Revelation and through some of the Christian apocalypse. That Magog is also kind of this further north, uh, uh, kind of scary barbarian folk that are further to the north. Later on, even again, people said it was Russia, but these are people probably again that are inhabiting Asia Minor and maybe the Caucasus. What other ones that really are important? The Tarshish, right? We hear about Tarshish and Jonah, and is this probably the city of Tarsus, which is in Turkey? These were colonies that again, according to the Bible, there were already European type peoples, Aegean peoples that were living in those places, and we know that the Dodanim here. Let's see if the note here, yeah, this is an example of probably a scribal error, because in the Septuagint, in the Greek translation, the word is Rodanim. So the Dalet and the Resh look very similar. It's a little tail here. So if a scribe had made an error, it's probably Rodanim, which is the island of Rhodes, which is a Greek island today, but it's right off the coast of Turkey. So it's not far. It's north of Crete and Cyprus, and that's the other places that are mentioned here. Kitim and Lisha are probably Cyprus. So these are Aegean islands, and when you look at what it says here, it's from these that the maritime nations branched out. They're really talking about here about the Philistines and other Aegean peoples that settle the area. Remember, there's two really big maritime peoples. There's the Philistines, which, according to the Bible, come from Greece. And based on what we know of the archaeology, we believe they came from Greece originally, from the Aegean, from, you know, Greek areas, and then to Crete and to Cyprus, and then to eventually to the coast of Israel. So that's one way people moved along the Mediterranean. The other way they moved was from Israel. because we also know that there was this amazing group of maritime traders and sometimes pirates, but and eventually an empire that were the Phoenicians, who eventually become the empire, the Carthaginian Empire, the Empire of Carthage, and they come from Phoenicia. They come from Lebanon. We're going to see them in a second. They start on the east and move to the west. So you have some people coming from the west going east, the Philistines, and then you have some that are in the east going west, and those are the Phoenicians. And they're both different. And according to the Bible, they're different. And according to what we know linguistically, they were different. But they're both very important. And they both are working in a world that the average Hebrew doesn't work with, which is the coast. Most Israelites did not live on the coast. That was not their world. And they didn't really engage that much in commerce because most of the cities along the coast were not Israelite and then later on Judean cities. Eventually, during the time of King Herod, Jews started, and we have it in the book of, in the Kings. There's trading that's going on in Solomon's time, but it still seems to be dominated by Phoenicians. It's almost like we're contracting out with the Phoenicians to do this, to do the maritime trade. But by the time of King Herod, there were definitely some Jewish commercial ventures. There were Jewish traders, and there were Jews that were settling in these places too. As we talked about on Wednesday night, when Paul goes out and starts working with these Jewish communities and these God-fearers that are living in different places in the Mediterranean, there are Jews living all around the Mediterranean, and they were obviously engaged in commerce. But during the biblical period, really that wasn't our thing. Was there an occasional Israelite who became a merchant and a seafarer? Sure, but it wasn't our thing. It wasn't the norm.
Have we
And so
found
that's
any Phoenician boats like dug up? I
oh
mean,
yeah, oh yeah. We
yeah.
have we have yeah we have Phoenician boats, and they definitely are different than the Greek boats, but there was also a lot of sharing too eventually, and some of it comes, some of the interaction came in Israel, some of it came in Egypt, some of it came in North Africa, and some of it came in Turkey. So these maritime people, and that's what when they're talking about these these maritime nations, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about people who work off the islands. The islands are their bases, and when you're on an island, especially like if you're an island like Rhodes, my wife and I finally visited Rhodes this last year, which used to have a huge Jewish community, a very large, I mean, percentage-wise Jewish community, but Rhodes never had that many people, but it was an island where you had to be engaged in commerce because it's not that big of a place, and you have to constantly be trading and working with other islands. And sometimes it would be controlled by the Greeks, and sometimes it would be controlled by the Romans, and sometimes it was controlled by the Saracens, by the Moorish armies. And so these nations, or these city states, these in some cases these islands were interesting little outposts of language and family. So that is the first branch. So they actually kind of worked, even though the list of them sometimes is Shem, Ham, and Japhet, they worked backwards. They went Japhet, and now they're going Ham, and then they're going to get to, as the author sometimes does, reaches the climax of the. And again, this is the P author. This isn't the J author. So there's not a lot of explanation. There's just these are the peoples, but we're going to get to the big deal.
And I have two questions.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming that my lineage, we're descendants of Ashkenaz and Gomer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, your family. Look, if you're European, they are.
Yes.
Your family,
German.
yeah, but your
I got a
family.
little of everything.
I know,
Russian. Polish.
but your family is Semitic, because when you go back far enough, you're Jewish, and so if you're Jewish, look, if we're Ashkenazi Jews, we have a healthy dose of European blood in us, right? That
Mhm.
it's just a fact. We've done the DNA and we know what it is. But our DNA also is Israelite. It actually goes back 3,000 years to the land of Israel, to the Middle East. So
Shem.
most Ashkenazi Jews are Semites. And again, we're going to see this when well, you know what? I'm just going to show. I'm going to pop it up now. The map, the map of these tribes, these peoples is it's obviously important because it is um you see on the map Shem, Ham, and Japhet. This is in the biblical description. It's not quite so easy just to say that the Hamites are all in North Africa because you can see some of them are in Arabia. These other kingdoms are listed. Canaan is listed as a Hamite. You can see the descendants of Japhet, the Philistines and the Kittim. Yeah, they're not up here; they're down here. Um, and of course, the Semites are going to be down here, but we also have eventually
So you're saying there's
Semites.
archaeological
As
evidence?
Semites, we're going to be all over here too. We're going to be everywhere, the Semites. So it's not, even during the biblical period, it's not so crystal clear. I mean, look, for the most part, the green areas, Japhet is Europe. And for the most part, Hamites are here in Africa. But it's not quite that. And what you see, of course, is that they all come together here. They come together around the land of Israel, right? So all of these peoples come together here, which is what we're concerned with. We're concerned with like how are the people that we come into contact with there. So look, when people say, well, they don't talk about the Chinese and they don't talk about the Australians and they don't talk about sub-Saharan Africa, right? Because all of Africa down below here isn't mentioned. I mean, you got Libya, you've got Sudan, you've got maybe again north part of Ethiopia, but you don't have most of Africa. So they're not here. This is not everybody in the whole world. These are the people that we came into contact with in the land of Israel. This is the people we care about. Not that, again, the other people aren't important, but they're not the people we interact with. So we don't have India, we don't have China, we don't have Southern Africa, but we do have these people right here who are the people that we're coming into contact with. And we want to know where they came from. And so the Bible gives us this thing. But again, it's not so easy just to say everybody's, it's not you can't just draw a map and say that's the red part, that's the blue part, that's the green, which is the way they sometimes do it. Sometimes you'll see a map, like a biblical map, and they'll say, whatever the color for Ham is, that North Africa is all that color. It's not, because there definitely are places that are described that are Hamite that are not in Africa. So let's take a look why, because some of them are clearly not Africa.
My next question,
Yeah.
sorry everybody, but I
Yeah.
just why do you think I mean, you may or may not have an answer. You notice that the author speaks about Gomer and Yavin, but not about Magog, Madai, Tubal, Mesh, and Tyrese, right?
Oh, okay. So, yeah. So they don't give all of the yeah. They don't
Why
give
not?
so it's interesting, right? So Madai, the Medians are not mentioned here. The Medians were important because they're right by Persia. Um, the most likely is that these are people that are important because we actually come into contact with with the key team, right? These are the Philistines. We don't really, I mean, Ashkenaz is interesting because we really don't come into contact with these people. So, the guess is that either um, there were other lines here and they just weren't kept, or we didn't get into it because we're really only concerned with these because these are the people that we actually come into contact. We don't really come into that much contact with these guys with Gomer, but we do come into contact with these guys with the key team and maybe again Elisha, which is probably also on the island of Cyprus. So the people that we like most come into contact with are these people, and it seems to be again this issue, which is um, who do we really care about that are descendants of Japhet? The Philistines.
Okay.
But again, it could be that there were other ones. The other ones just dropped out. They just didn't, either scribal error, or people say, who cares? Like, but again, we don't get we don't get a lot of the, if you will, we get the grandsons. We don't get a lot of great grandsons, if you will. We don't get the next generation, like in this one.
Okay. All right. The descendants of, okay, move on.
Mhm.
The descendants of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. The descendants of Cush, Seba, Havilah, Sabeth, Ramah, Sabteka. The descendants of Ramah. Interesting. Okay. Sheba and Dedan.
Yeah, so stop right there. So this is another example where we're going to get some other next generations, but we generally don't get them unless they're going to be important. So we don't get all of Ham's descendants, but we're going to get Cush right here because Cush has these clans, these people, and of course some of them become important later on. The Sabaeans are important later on. Sheba, the Queen of Sheba, which I
Ah,
believe is probably Yemen. And um and the other thing, of course, is that Cush also has this guy, Nimrod. And now we're going to get into, before we get into more genealogy, we get a little excursus, a little journey into into this guy, Nimrod, who, again, mini narrative. This is not a big narrative. And I will show you that, like when if we looked at what's happening here, um, again, we're going to drop out of the first part of this is the P author, and then we're going to drop into the J author. Now, the J author is going to give us the story of Nimrod, because we have Cush, which now allowed us to get a little thing on Cush. What's interesting is that the genealogy that he lays out now, after that, the rest of the J story is not, it's not really, um, it's not really uh, following, if you will, the setup that we had here. So um, it's going to go into back and forth between the J author in blue and the P author, who gives us details of how old people are and how who begot who, but not these little mini stories. That is important because we're left with a, if you will, a genealogy list that is kind of a combination of stuff. But this little story, which is only a couple lines, is also a story that fascinated our ancestors and developed um, a lot of midrash, a lot of midrash. So let's read this story, a mini story.
Cush also begot Nimrod, who was the first of the earth's heroes. He was a mighty hunter by the grace of God. Hence the saying, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter by the grace of God. I have a question though.
Yeah,
We always seem to use it as derogatory,
yeah. So
right?
yeah,
Right? Don't be a Nimrod.
yeah, exactly.
And
So
I never knew where that came from ever.
yeah. Well, it's a riff on this, but it's not really what you'd think a Nimrod was, right? So Nimrod in the story is a mighty hunter who's a scary guy. We'll get into it. Let's finish.
Okay.
Let's finish.
All right. The mainstays of his kingdom were Babylon, Iraq, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar.
Yeah. So let's pause right there because that's really the mini story. And you hear uh what's the note here, that Kalne is probably not a place. Babylon, Erech, and Akkad are, and we know of all those three cities. These are cities that were the heartland of the Babylonians, and the Assyrian, what would be later on the Assyrian Empire. These were the early cities that became those city states. And what this author seems to be doing is not giving us uh, a split into three, but really telling us that Nimrod was the ancestor of the uh, of these Akkadian Babylonian people. That he's the guy who creates the first great empires. Now, according to this, he is a mighty hunter, and he has, to some extent, like a mythological. Um, it's hinted at, if you will, or it's at least there's enough here that we can start building a mythological reputation for this guy. So what's going on? So again, the cities are they're the big cities, and we'll get to it when we get to the story of Babel, the Tower of Babel. These were the places where the earliest ziggurats were. These were the cities that become the great empire, the foundations of empires, and they were scary to some extent. They were scary to us because these cities become very powerful, um, and very, if you will, tyrannical. They Nimrod is seen in our midrash as a crazy, and you don't really get it, necessarily just from the few lines we have here, but he's a megalomaniacal, um, destructive force, but he has powers. And where did he get them from? Well, according to the midrash, and by the way, hunting was very important in ancient Assyrians, Babylonians. There's several depictions we have of their kings hunting with dogs and with hunting lions and hunting, engaged in hunting. It was a big part of their culture was hunting. So the fact that he's described as a hunter is consistent with the information we have of these people at the time. But according to tradition, the midrash, the way he gets his power is that he has Adam's garment. Yeah, the garment that God made for Adam. And that garment, because it's made by God, has special powers. Now, the powers, according to tradition, are powerful enough that Noah had this garment previously. And what the garment does is it gives you control over animals. So if you're a great hunter and you have complete control over the animals, you can hunt and kill anything you want. It's also maybe that he hunted man, that he hunted the greatest, right? The greatest game was
Most dangerous game.
yeah, right. He hunted humans. So that's another possibility that that's what Nimrod engaged in. But he's a frightening guy. There's a frightening midrashic uh, set of text about him that he's even around during the time of Abraham and that he goes after Abraham. We're going to share that midrash at the end, but because we're going to get to maybe we'll get to Abraham today, but Avram. But this Nimrod is the prototypical tyrant, and he wants people to worship him. That um, he's the one who engages in building these. He's the one who builds the Tower of Babel in the text. In the next story, we read about the creation of this tower, and the tradition was as Nimrod did it. Um, yeah, let me share with you a little bit right now. First is this midrashic. There's so much midrash on this that it just became like accepted. It wasn't even like it was midrash anymore. It's just like Nimrod was Abraham's rival, older rival, but someone who would destroy him. And it just became so well known that people just thought it was in the Bible. Here, I'm going to show you an interesting place that the Midrash got so big. Um, in the Quran, which really relied on Midrash, it says that Abraham is confronted by a king who tells him, uh, the Quran says, "Have you not considered the one who argued with Abraham about his Lord, because Allah had given him kingship? When Abraham said, 'My Lord is the one who gives life and causes death,' he said, 'I give life and cause death.'" Now it doesn't say that this is Nimrod, but we know what we know what it was based on, because it's all over the place. This is Josephus's use of midrash, and again, I want to show you because it's not, Josephus, um, was writing a history for people who didn't even have the Bible in front of him. So this is 600 years before the Quran. Look how you get this. Now, it was Nimrod who excited them to such an affront and contempt of God. He was the grandson of Ham, son of Noah, a bold man of great strength of hand. He persuaded them not to ascribe it to God as if it was through his means they were happy, but to believe that it was their own courage which procured the happiness. See what the Quran talked about? This is exactly what we had, and we have it in the Midrash, but man, when we started reading Josephus, we're like, oh, that's what people said about Nimrod. He also gradually changed the government into tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God, but to bring them into a constant dependence on his power. He also said he would be revenged on God if he should have a mind to drown the world again. For that he would build a tower too high for the waters to be able to reach, and that he would avenge himself on God for destroying their forefathers. So you see, the midrash on this is that he built the Tower of Babel to get back at God for the flood. Obviously, also to make sure that we couldn't get drowned by a flood anymore. But you see how Nimrod, how bold he was, how
He was an
how
anarchist.
well, he wasn't an anarchist. He was actually a full on tyrant. But he wanted to replace God, which is one of the reasons why when we get to the Tower of Babel, we can get this. Now, share with you one other midrash on this, which ties together Nimrod and the Tower of Babel. Um, Actually, no, I'll save this one from the Zohar for a second. Uh, we got to read a little bit more before we get to that. So, but you can see that Nimrod becomes this prototypical tyrant, denier of God, literally saying gods are bad. And you understand where that comes from because it's the thought that goes through our head. If God can destroy us, then we need to destroy God. It's that fear that breeds not humility, but instead, you know,
Well, you think he would have learned, though, that that's not the case,
yeah, but
right?
this
Because
this
God did the flood, then he
this
let
this
people
is
live.
this is hubris, right? This is somebody taking the fear that they have and directing it in a very self-destructive way. But people do it all the time, right? That's the thing, is people continuously do this. And so there are several ways that we can say we've seen this be manifest in our own time, right? People who have no take their fears and turn them into strange and self-destructive ways, right? But also, again, believing that there's no need to have humility. There's no need to ever have any sense of perspective that, our time here is limited. He took it as no, I'm in the time that I have, I'm going to try to destroy the thing that could destroy us. And again, it's not that it comes from a place of, like, you can understand the logic. You'd say it's foolish, but there's a logic to it, which is let's destroy the God before it destroys us. So,
Well, it's interesting. And I don't know, does anybody on here? Because I just did the research. Does anybody know why we say don't be a Nimrod?
so what did it tell you about Nimrod?
Nimrod?
Yeah.
Well, I just want to see. Does anybody know? Because I didn't know. I said, don't be a Nimrod. I know. Judith,
It's
come
an
on, you know everything of everything.
it's an interesting tale.
I don't know that one.
So sorry, Rabbi, I'm not stealing your thunder here,
No,
but
no, but
I don't.
you can take them through the progression of how Nimrod
The
came
from
into
what I'm reading, what the rabbi said is the way we should use it, right? Don't be a Nimrod, don't chase power, don't control people, don't be a Nimrod. But we use it, right, to say don't be an idiot, right? So I guess the guys that were doing Bugs Bunny, right? They when Elmer Fudd was trying to be a great hunter and he sucked at it, right? They threw in the biblical reference, right? Don't be Elmer Fudd, don't be a Nimrod, right?
Yep.
That's where it comes from. Don't be an idiot because he was a terrible hunter, Elmer Fudd.
Yep. And so it became
So
a
Bugs
pejorative of
Bunny changed poor Nimrod's entire
into
legacy.
a fool. Yeah. But it is that was
Never
not what
do
it's
that.
been for most of human history. But yeah, it's Bugs Bunny. It's Mel Blanc's, don't
Yeah.
be a Nimrod, that but he meant it, it was funny the way they did it because again, it was not meant to be. That's the progression of it. But again, understand that he's scary. That's the thing about it. And again, that was my, until I kind of read all the midrashim about midrash, and there's so many. I mean, it's not like there's two. There's like 2,000. It is so much legend about Nimrod, and a lot of it was again putting the worst, Roman uh, emperors on it, or the worst, Assyrian. Because we had thousands of years even by the time of the Midrash, we had a good 1,000 years of really bad and tyrannical, megalomaniacal people, and that we saw. And again, a lot of them would be hunters. A lot of them were, tough guys, if you will. So, but again, for us, he had this magical cloak, which must have given him this advantage. He must have had him an advantage somehow. All right, the J author continues really with how the Babylonian and Assyrian people got their power, which is going to take us to the Tower of Babel. But so this is kind of going off of the genealogy that we had previously, but it's almost like now we're kind of taken in a slightly different direction. But the reason for it is to establish the Mesopotamian dynasties. Here we go.
From that land, Asher went forth and built Nineveh, Rehoboth, and Kalal, and Resen between Nineveh and Kalal. That is the great city.
Yeah, and so those are the Babylonian cities or Mesopotamian cities. Now we're going to get to some other peoples that we know of, which again, this author is concerned with the peoples that this is clearly people that we come into contact with. There's a little difference here, but we'll get to it in a second.
And Mizraim begot the Ludim, the Anamim, the Lahabim, the Naphturim. Sorry, the Pathrusim, the Kalu, hold on,
Yeah.
Kasluhim, from whom the Philistines came, and the Kaphtorim.
Yeah. So in this version, the Philistines kind of come out of the Egyptians, which is not quite the case. They did come into contact with the Egyptians, but they weren't the Egyptians. And according to this, they're not Japhethites, if you will, but they're Hamites. Now, they definitely settled in Egypt and they definitely had areas in Egypt that were Philistine cities, but they weren't Egyptian. But as far as this author is concerned, that's where they're from. This is not the threefold kind of thing that, and so that's why when people like when you look at the map, you're like, why is this person here and this person here? It's because it's just not that. The P author has the people much more in their regions, if you will. This one is a mishmash, but it's also because like that's the only thing that this author is concerned with are the people that we actually come into contact with, the people that are like on our back door and or we're going to fight with. And of course, here we get to the big one.
Canaan begot Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusites, and the Amorites, and the Gigashites, the Girgashites, and the Hivites, and the Archites, and the Sinites, Sinites, sorry,
Sinites, Sinites.
Sinites, the Arvadites, the Semirites, and the Hamathites. Afterward, the clans of the Canaanites spread out. The original Canaanite territory extended from Sidon as far as Gerar near Gaza and as far as Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim near Lasha.
Yeah. So
So all in the south, I guess.
this author is concerned with the land of Israel, the Canaanite areas. The Canaanite areas are Sidon, which is all the way up in Beirut, by Beirut, all the way down to the south, all the way down to Gaza. So the Canaanites are inhabiting this area, and they're inhabiting all the way to the Dead Sea. Sodom and Gomorrah are out by the Dead Sea. So this area, which is essentially greater Israel, if you will, this is an area where the Canaanites spread out. So it does say that they're descendants of, you know, they're descendants of Ham, but like linguistically and ethnically, they're pretty close to us. They don't seem to be descendants of Ham. But remember, uh, this dude back here, Nimrod, was a descendant of him, and he built these cities like Nineveh and these other places. So it's really telling us, at least, I mean, it seems pretty apparent. Should it feel pretty apparent to you now that the J author is basically telling us that the descendants of Ham were the ones who established these communities for better or worse, and a lot of it's worse because we know that these places are going to wind up being places where bad things happen, including obviously Sodom and Gomorrah. But yeah, I mean, it's really explaining it's explaining that. And so again, here it says,
These are the descendants of Ham, according to their clans and languages, by their lands and nations. Sons were also born to Shem, ancestor of all the descendants of Eber, and
oh,
older bro-
I hadn't gotten to that, but yeah, now we're going to get to the Semites. So that's Ham. That's
Okay,
the Ham people. And then here we have the
okay, okay.
Semites. Now we have Shem and Japhet, right? Like in this author's version, if you will. Yeah.
You know, it seems that Shem was selected over Japheth, right?
Yeah.
And what's your take on that? Why Shem, not Japheth? They both did a good
Yeah.
thing by covering up Noah.
Because Shem's our ancestor.
Well, I understand that, but it easily could have been Japheth.
But it wasn't.
No,
Shem
I
was
have
our
no,
ancestor. So Shem is our ancestor. So what we're left with is that we're left with. I'm going to give you the answer. The answer is the Hamites are bad people. They're bad people.
right.
The Semites are good people because there are people. And the Japhetites are not bad. And they're, again, if you go back to the story of Noah, they do good, they do something good. But they're not us. they're good enough. And again, when we talked about it last week, and it is important because it carries over into this week, the Europeans are then considered to be in our tent, right? They're in our community. The Hamites are the ones we have problems with. And the reason we have problems with the Hamites are because these are people we had problems with. The question of which comes first, do we have problems with them and then they're Hamites? Or again, so is everybody we have a problem with really Hamitic? That's part of what might be happening here is what we're really asked the question is where do the bad things come from? They come from Ham. And so, you know, Yaphet is going to be okay, even though they're not. They're
My
not
my
us. They're going to be okay.
my question was though, Rabbi, God chose Shem, right, as
Yeah.
opposed to Japheth.
Yeah.
What? What's your take on that?
Um,
In other words, he could easily have chosen Japheth for the Semites.
so yes, but he doesn't. It's not that he chose that 1/3 of the peoples. It's that we're going to get a couple of people that get us to, according to again this guy right here, Ever. We're going to get to Abraham. What you're jumping ahead with is really this question is how does I don't know if you're aware that you're asking this question, but eventually the Bible is going to get to it's not about it. We God's not going to work with God's going to work with a family. God's going to work with a guy and that's Abraham and his wife Sarah, and that's where this is all going to come out of. So it's almost as if you had a family, you had the first family, they become lots of people here in these chapters, and then we get back to one family.
No, no, I understand that. I understand Abraham is a descendant of Shem. I understand that, right? But it easily, right? God could have chosen, yeah, chosen, and I know we're going to get there. I'm just wondering your take. Like like it could have been a descendant of Japheth. It could have been one of his descendants that was the Abraham of that was. In other words, right? God chose Shem and eventually chose Abraham. I'm just wondering why he chose. What's your? I mean, you don't have an answer. I mean, what's
No,
your
no.
what's your
So,
rabbinical? What's your
so,
analysis? What do you think?
so I think it's based on the fact that um, and again, the rabbis asked that same question. We don't have a clear answer in the Bible of why Abraham and why he's picked. Look, at the end of the day, you go back down. You go from Abraham, and then you go backwards, right? You get back to Noah, and you get back to Adam. So the genealogy always goes back. It keeps going back. Why this guy in particular is an interesting question, and that's why we get the midrash. That's why we have the Nimrod literature, is because Avram fights with Nimrod. Nimrod tries to destroy Avram right from the beginning. We're going to get to that too. So there's this weird setup, that the rabbis see with it. But, look, the other possibility is Avram's our ancestor. We're the descendants of Avram. How did we get there? And that these stories are the links to how we get there. They were the attempt that our ancestors had to say, well, this is how we got there. Now, again, you could say, well, what about these other kids? It's just that we know where we're trying to get, and so we're going to get to that point one way or the other. And it's normal. I mean, what we have here are normal tales of genealogies that we have in the ancient world. But again, what happens to these other people? We don't know sometimes. Let's read. Let's go through the rest
Okay.
of Jay's
I'll
offering.
I'll read some midrash about that because it'll be interesting to think what the rabbis thought about long
About,
ago.
okay,
That'll be
when we get to Avram, maybe some of it will come out. But let's we do have a little bit more midrash to
Let's
get
go.
to today.
Sons were also born to Shem, ancestor of all the descendants of Eber, and older brother Japheth. The
So
descendants of
so so by the way, that's a giveaway right there. Ever right here, the ancestor of I mean, why did it mention ever now? Because we haven't gotten to him yet. He's a couple generations later. So a few generations later. So why did it mention him? And that's because Ever is definitely one of those ancestors who's a standout. We don't know why. But we do know that the word Ever is the ancestor, is the word is the ancestor for the word Hebrew. What does a Hebrew mean? Right? What's a Hebrew? And that by itself is again an interesting question because the word ever might have some interesting meanings, right? Ever means one who crosses over, one who goes from one place to another. And it could be that we're Hebrews were partly based on the fact that we are people who think outside the box or are outside the box or travel outside the box because there's some way that we're kind of spreading or crossing over. The word ever means to cross over. And when the rabbis in the Midrash in particular talk about the tents of Shem, we're also that Japhet is going to find a place in. It's not just obviously a tent, it's a school of thought. It's actually a Beit Midrash, it's actually a school. And the rabbis talked about the schools of Shem and Ever, that Shem and his descendant Ever are both teaching people these things. They're the link to get to Avram, because there's again this question is how did Avram get this? Well, Ever is mentioned here. He's singled out. We're going to read about him, and of course Shem being the ancestors of Abraham. That there's a continuity. That there's something going on here. That it wasn't just Abraham just having a revolutionary idea, but that he was being instructed, he was being schooled by some of these ancestors who were standouts, just like we had with Enoch, we had with Methuselah, that we have this list, we have these lists of people. And when somebody's pointed out, well, maybe there's something there. Maybe there's a midrash there. So, um, so he's been mentioned here. So let's take a look.
The descendants of Shem, Elam, Ashur, Arpachshad, Lud, and Aram. The descendants of Aram, Uz, Hul, Gether, and Mosh. Arpachshad begot Shelah, and Shelah begot Ever. Two sons were born to Ever. The name of the first was Peleg. For his days the earth was divided, and the name of his brother was Yoktan.
So let's just look at the note here. They're saying it's a play on the word. Peleg is from Niflega, which is this is when the division happens. This is when the next story will happen, but it's a play on the name Peleg. Um, so we're going to get to the divisions in a second.
Yoktan begot Almadad, Shelpha, Hasmara, Yera, Hadoram, Uzal, Dikla, Obal, Abimal, Sheba, Orpher, Havilah, and Yabal. All these were the descendants of Yoktan.
Right. So these are all people that live in the area of um, of Arabia, right? From Arabia and Yemen. Now, here's an example of two conflicting, in one in J and one in P. Look, I don't want to get hung up on it because this is not necessarily meant to be literal anyways. But here it just said that Shiva was a Semite, right? Back here it said that the Shivites were Hamites. There's could be differences. It could be slightly different, understandings of how like mixes of people, but it's sometimes confusing. Uh, oh wait, why don't you read a little bit more? Sorry.
Their settlements extended from Mesha as far as Safar, the hill country, to the east. These are the descendants of Shem, according to their clans and languages, by their lands according to their nations. These are the groupings of Noah's descendants, according to their origins, by their nations, and from these the nations branched out over the earth after the flood.
Okay. So, uh, yeah, there's definitely an understanding of, uh, in one place that, the focus is really on the world kind of being divided into three nicely, the P author. And the J author is a little bit different. And we really get to, you know, they're the descendants of certain peoples, and it doesn't matter what exactly area they lived in because their families would spread around, and the problems really come from these certain peoples. This is the end of this is the end of that you know table of nations, if you will, but it's not in a way because it's going back and forth between the different authors. The J author has something else to tell us, whereas these kind of are really good endings to the P authors lists of how we got to these places. I'm only saying this because when I point it out, it's because it's such a weird transition. The P author is telling us how we got these different languages in these different regions, and it's kind of, pretty straightforward. The next line says everyone on earth had the same language and words. I mean, right there, it just said there's all these different languages. And then right here, it says they're all the same words. Because in one version of the story, as we're reading it, they are still of one language. The P author is pretty fine now telling you that's how we wound up with the different languages that we have. Not, not the J author. The J author has a wonderful story, and this is what we're going to finish with today, which is a very, very short story. Uh, it's 8 verses or 9 verses, and we're going to read the Tower of Babel. We could break here, but I don't like to do the Table of Nations without doing this, which is because if God, look, we have a lot of people that aren't here today, and I apologize to those people that are watching it. They're going to watch it. Hope you watch it afterwards. You can't really understand the Tower of Babel story, these 9 verses, without really having in your mind what we just read, which is how these nations are going to spread out, if you will, because our ancestors who would not accept that these are written by two different authors simply are telling you, well, yeah, we're going to get into those different splits, but let's kind of step back for a second into what happens before we split. Okay, let's read this story. Judith, you want to read the Tower of Babel story? This is a very well-known story, which you're going to learn something from. I promise you, you're going to see something in the story that you never saw before. I promise.
I already did. I've never connected it to the Table of Nations, as you call it.
Yeah,
But
well, I didn't call it that.
but
That's the
you know what I
fancy
mean.
name.
But
That's
that's
the fancy name for
I
it.
know, but that's
If you're a
I've
biblical historian, that's what they call it,
yeah,
Table of
I
Nations.
like that.
By the way, I have a really interesting one of my favorite Bible commentaries. It's very short. It's a Bible commentary that Isaac Asimov wrote. It's called In the Beginning, and unfortunately it only goes to this. It ends with the Table of Nations. It only goes to that part. It's like he wanted to write more, but he didn't. And it's a really great biblical commentary on Genesis. uh, he's got an amazing mind, and he's Jewish, and he brings a little bit of that to it. But he also is a scientist, and he's also a thinker, and so he talks about the different authors, but he also tries to help us see the more mythological elements to this. But this story captivated our attention from the earliest times. And again, like the flood story, is one of those mythological stories that's got a really deep message in 9 verses. So let's read it.
Everyone on earth had the same language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them hard." Brick served them as stone, and bitumen served them as mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build us a city and a tower with its top in the sky to make a name for ourselves, else we shall be scattered all over the world." God came down to look at the city and tower that the mortals had built. And God said, "If, as one people with one language for all, this is how they have begun to act, then nothing that they may propose to do will be out of their reach. Let us then go down and confound their speech there, so that they shall not understand one another's speech." Thus God scattered them from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there God confounded the speech of the whole earth, and from there God scattered them over the face of the whole earth.
And that's the story. The next line is literally gets into the P author giving us the genealogy of Abraham, which we'll read next week. What do you think of this? What do you think of this story, this 9 verse story that
Was God afraid of their power?
Mhm.
well, definitely it seems as though these people, and we read I showed you the midrash of Nimrod trying to destroy God, right? So, you know, but you know, it's interesting that part of this, of course, is their journey, right? They journeyed from the east, so they moved west. They came from Kedem, they came from the east, and they moved there, and they come into this land of Shinar. Now, we know that they're talking about building ziggurats. We know that they're talking about building, um, these kind of things, which the ancient Israelites saw, and they are they're still amazing. I mean, this is the one in Ur, which is the city that Avraham comes from, according to the Bible. Um, these are amazing things. I mean, they're truly still amazing to see. Not nearly as tall as the pyramids, by the way. I just want to make it very clear. These things, this is all the same place. This is Ur, the ziggurat of Ur, in a modern day Iraq. About 1/4 as tall, third as tall as the pyramids, right? So not nearly as tall. Which you're wondering, like, what's why the pyramids are much older? So why is there nothing in the Bible about the pyramids, right? Why isn't there a knock on the pyramids? Well, what's interesting about the ziggurats is that they actually were designed to go towards the sky, and they were temples. Pyramids are not temples, they're tombs. Everything in the pyramid that's of importance, if you will, is down below. Now, again, we think that there's obviously some astrological significance and astronomical significance to the pyramids, but these ziggurats were temples that were meant to be a place where the heavens where people would ascend to the heavens to communicate with God or to be with God, and they were temples. Similar in that way to some of the stuff that we see in Mexico, right, where people built temples as high up as they could. Now, could be could be that they didn't really get that high, which is when it says God came down to look at the city, it means that God, it wasn't right in God's backyard, right? They when it says that God came down, the rabbis point out to some extent, um, they hadn't built that, they weren't that high. So there's a little bit of yeah, let's be real. What's really happening here. You're not really that good. But I will tell you that there's another interesting midrash, which I said is in the Zohar, captured in the Zohar, but it's an old midrash. Rabbi Chia then discoursed as follows: "It is written, the Lord said, Behold, they are one people and they have one language." After this, we read, and it came to pass they journeyed mik- mikadem, which comes from the word uh, from the away from the ancient one. They came away from Kadmon. They came away from God, and that they found. Now we would normally not see the word found there, but the word saw. But instead it says found, which means that they found something there. And it says that they found remnants of the secret wisdom that had been left there by the generation of the flood. And with that, they made their attempt to provoke the Holy One. Blessed be he, as they said, so they did. So, what's interesting here is this idea that maybe in this place they found something, right? They found something here, which again, they didn't translate. You didn't know, you didn't miss it because the translation doesn't say it right here. But you see the word vayimtseu, the word matzah, not matzah that we eat in Passover, but matzah to find, right? To bring forth, right? That they, when it says that they came upon, that they actually found something there, which is an interesting midrash on that word. So they found this ancient technology that allowed them to build these things. And of course, the Midrash here is hinting at this idea that they went backwards, going back to what they were like before the flood. And so God has to get involved again. Now, the rabbis also point out what's going on here with the construction, right? That they're making bricks and they're burning them hard, right? Now, what the rabbis interpret from this, some of you might know this midrash, was that their bricks became more important than anything else, in the sense that if somebody died, they didn't stop, right? And in some cases, people would fall into the mortar and they just kept pounding it, and the people themselves were eventually there were bodies in the building because they wouldn't stop at all to build this. The building of it became so important that had no they had no value for human life. So the construction becomes all consuming for them. And so they build this building, and what are they trying to do? Make a name for themselves, right?
We found any bones? Like like
No,
okay.
no, we haven't. But there is this idea that there are people who construct things at such a maniacal and you know, kind of crazy level where they will just allow people to die for the construction of what they want.
With the Great Wall of China, right?
Well, there's a lot of stuff, right?
Yeah.
We saw the Soviets do it. I mean, the Soviets were the worst at this. The Soviets, all they tried to do is build the biggest thing. They would build the biggest whatever, and so they did it. And of course, the Soviets were one of the best examples of people who tried to do away with the diversity and the differences that existed and try to make everybody, well, they made everyone in their empire speak Russian, but they obliterated ethnicities and religions because they wanted everybody to be part of the one nation. And so to me, that's the best example of what we're afraid of here, which is that we're going to literally have one one way of doing things, one society, one way. And part of it, of course, was their goal, which was to have fame and power for the sake of fame and power. Now, I will tell you that this midrash, this kind of understanding of the brick becoming more valuable than human life, is in the midrash, and actually we have depictions of it. We have an archaeological a beautiful example. This is a synagogue mosaic that we found in Hukok in northern Israel, and in the Galilee. And this is a mosaic of the Tower of Babel. And what's interesting about it is we actually see people falling from the tower. We see people fighting and hurting them, hurting, in the construction that they're fighting, and there's um obviously but by the way, look at the different ethnicities, right? We have all these different ethnicities represented in the construction. So we can see that this is a, that this is a midrash, if you will, a visual midrash of the tales and of the legends and lessons that had developed around the Tower of Babel. And so when we found this, it was like, oh my gosh, these are the midrashim we have. These are the bricks,
How old is this?
1700 years old.
Wow. Okay.
So, look, we know that when a tyrant forces a building project, that generally speaking, it's for their name, it's for their reputation, right? It's going to make them famous. They need to do this because they want to create a legacy. And of course, it's like the worst act of arrogance. And this, of course, is like the worst act of arrogance, which is to create a tower that is going to
Up in the
reach,
sky.
reach, reach God, be higher than God. And it's that type of arrogance that that the Bible really cautions at. And what's so interesting again is that the punishment for this is that God says we need everybody to speak different languages, because if they're united, they're going to continue to do these kinds of stuff. And now
I
again,
really, oh, excuse me.
yeah,
I really like the analogy with the Soviet Union. I
yeah,
mean, the idea of that all people should all be one and do one thing. I never had look. That's the best explanation of the Tower of I mean, a metaphor that I can actually really see
yeah.
it.
I went to the Soviet Union in '89 before it fell, and they were taking us around and they would show us this. The tour guides were all in tourist KGB officers that would, they were the only people that could take you around were these guides, and they would always say, this is the biggest this is the biggest that, this is the largest statue, this is the largest whatever, this is bigger than the Statue of Liberty, and for them this was a sign that their country was better than the United States or the most powerful nation in the world, whatever it was. And the sad thing is it was all a facade. All you had to do was go back, behind the building, and you'd see it was collapsing. And so it was one of the great lessons was that, yeah, the Tower of Babel was going to collapse because it was built with literally a mission, a vision, a goal of doing something wrong. And so is the Soviet Union, obliterating, the ethnicities and obliterating the diversity that existed in the Soviet Union and that had existed with all those republics and all those autonomous communities that the Soviets decided we're going to, through Russification, we're going to do away with all of this. It was a crazy, it was a crazy, the extreme of this. And what's interesting is the Bible really does seem to be telling us, at least this author is telling us, that the goal of humanity, or at least the way that God envisions that this is going to play out, is that we're going to be diverse. We're meant to be diverse. That it's okay. Not only is it okay for us to speak different languages, not only is it okay to look differently, that's the way God wants it. Now you could say it's so that we don't do crazy things where we all have a common purpose, which is going to wind up being, destructive.
Well, I could
But look,
also see Iran too. Look at the way Iran was cut out.
there's a lot of places that, again, if they try to impose one religion on everybody, or they try to impose one mode of thought on everybody, this is what, again, our country was. I really think if you read what our founding fathers wrote, but whether it was Washington or Jefferson or these people, they really thought that a diverse country was going to be a good thing for us. It was going to allow this country to be great because we're bringing a pluribus unum, out of many one, but not out of one not that everyone has to be one, but that those people from different backgrounds are all going to be able to be different and all be part of one thing at the same time. That balance is so hard to achieve. It's so hard to maintain, but it's really what we're supposed to do. It's really what, when we think about it, what um what makes what makes the world beautiful. And the Bible really tells us that this is the way it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be. There's supposed to be differences, that we're all unified by common elements, right? Our humanity is it's something we all share, but what we have is this amazing ability to have different expressions and different ways of being human. And so it's not it the at least here, I mean, the takeaway from it is really, this is the way God wants it. God doesn't want us to all be the same. And so the word Babel comes from, obviously, Babel. It comes from that, Babylon, but it was really Babel because it was a place where babbling. And Babel is an onomatopoeia for blah, 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 just talking. So people at this point, God creates a miracle and makes people all start speaking different languages. And again, you could say, well, this is an explanation for why people speak different languages. What's interesting is the story really kind of hints at the fact that there was a time when everyone spoke the same language, which we don't know that that's the case. But if we all have a common ancestor, then at some point we did start moving out and start moving into different parts of the world. And of course, language developed later than that, right? There was the building of languages, but a common language is not something that we necessarily have to get towards. Though there are also interesting things to think about here. Has the internet created a Tower of Babel? Has the internet created a unified language? Has it created a unified place where humanity might be in the process of becoming homogenized and becoming all too all too much the same? People said, well, the proliferation of American or Western, stuff has ruined the world. There's a McDonald's or a Starbucks everywhere. But come on, I mean, in reality, those don't actually work. And for the most part, we've seen that most countries, even as they've become more westernized or they listen to rock music or whatever, they haven't lost their identity. Um, it's a difficult balance, right? We want everybody to be able to communicate. We want everybody to have the ability to be able to be connected, but at the same time, we don't want people to lose their identity. What's cool is that
Yeah,
now.
on the other hand, when they cut off like the internet, like in Iran, you want to hear the voices of everyone.
Correct. And that's why it's a very difficult balance. Like, it's a very difficult balance too. But technology allows us now with our Google Translate, I can talk to somebody, have it translated now. And, nowadays it's built into the interface that you have on your AirPods. You can literally hear a discussion, have it translated. And it doesn't mean that that person has to give up their language. It means I can understand their language and I can communicate with them, and they don't have to lose their language. I don't have to lose my language in order to communicate. So technology isn't all bad. It's not always going to just create, like some people say, it's going to wipe away all the differences. I think it also has the ability to allow people to be it allows people to be connected, but not to have their differences, effaced and destroyed. So look, it's a definite balance. It's not something that it's easy. The Tower of Babel captivated our imagination because there's something so human about this. There's something so human about us wanting to get into God's realm. That desire to do that. But if it's the desire just to have fame, if it's the desire just to aggrandize ourselves, that's not healthy. That's not something the Bible is, and Jewish tradition for sure, is trying to get us to do. It really wants us to aspire, to be godly and to even be godlike in some ways, right? To be B'Tselem Elohim. But we have to keep our feet on the ground. We have to understand that we are human and that we're our lofty ambitions, our lofty goals can't come at the expense of other humans, for sure. That the things that we construct really have to be, um, things that bring people together and allow them to have a seat at the table, and not, hey, really at the end of the day, there's only going to be a few people who get to sit at the top of the tower. So I love this story. It's one of my favorite stories. It captivated my imagination as a kid, and it continues to captivate my imagination because every year I read something new and I think about something new. And when I see people who have the worst elements of this, I'm just reminded there's nothing new here. There's nothing new here. We've got people who are trying to build stuff back in the day, back in the beginning, that they're missing the point. So yeah, don't be a Nimrod, that's for sure. And if Nimrod was the guy who was in charge of this, he also is going to come after our ancestor Avraham. And so today we're going to finish with a song about Nimrod, but it's really about Avraham. And while we didn't read about Abraham being born, uh, he will be born in the next text. And we're going to read about next week. We're going to pick up in chapter 11. We're going to get into the line of Shem, and we're going to get to, at the end of this, we're going to get to Avraham. But according to tradition,
Yes.
Avraham was alive during the construction of the Tower of Babel. Yeah.
I just wanted to say I wanted to dedicate part of this Torah study to the twins being born, so that
Yes.
have a Torah study dedicated to them. They start out with thinking of Torah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so we hope that they're blessed. The next when we get into the story of Avraham and Avraham being born, there's wonderful midrash that Nimrod tried to destroy Avraham. He tried to destroy him before he was even born. Sounds a lot like the Moses story, right? Sounds a lot like the Jesus story. This is a midrash that I'm going to share with you right now. This is the song Cuando el Rey Nimrod. This is a wonderful, one of the most famous Sephardic songs that exists. So this is a song from Sfarad. I'm going to share the music, and I'm also going to share the lyrics. You can see that this song about Nimrod and about Avraham, the midrash.
Querido Padre bendito, luz de Israel. Abraham, Padre querido, Padre bendito, luz de Israel.
Read the midrash.
Luego a las comadres encomendaba que toda mujer que preñada quedara, si no pariera al punto la matara, que había de nacer Abraham vino, Padre querido, Padre bendito, luz de Israel. Abraham, Padre querido, Padre bendito, luz de Israel. Cuando de Nimrod al campo de salía, miraba en cielo en la estrella, vio una luz santa en la judería, que había de nacer Abraham vino.
So that is now it's going to replay the chorus, but you can see the midrash, right? The story is that Avraham was they attempted to kill Avraham before he was born. So you can see that his mother ends up giving birth to him in a cave the translation also could be gave birth to him in a manger as she's trying to spare him. Because according to the Midrash, the full Midrash, even Avraham's father, Terach, was afraid for him to be born because he would be destroyed by Nimrod. So yeah, it's a very interesting story, interesting midrash. And what's interesting, of course, about this song is that it ends up saying that again, uh, that Nimrod went out to the Juderia, right? In Ladino, right? The Jewish quarter. Well, of course, there was no Jewish quarter yet because Avram wasn't born. But what you see is actually also the the reality for Jews living in Spain when the song first was written, that sometimes again they were living under difficult times. And so this story, even though it's a midrash about Abraham being like Moses or being like Jesus, there's also this, but it's also a statement of the way we live now under under the Spanish. So it's a really interesting kind of midrash within a midrash here too. So yeah, you can see how important midrash is in our consciousness, in our visual art, and also in our music. That midrash would oftentimes take a really important place. So thank you, everybody, for being here. Hopefully, again, you saw something in the Tower of Babel that you didn't see before. And in this, what would have been a very bland recitation of peoples, there's a lot in there. So next week, we'll have a chance to meet our ancestors, Avram and Sarah. So thank you, everybody, and we will see you soon. I hope tomorrow night, maybe even.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Take care, everybody.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye. Bye. Bye, everyone.